So we find this a lot, and then the example I gave about the faculty member wanting to engage the student saying, hey, what sport do you play? This assumption that we see our students where we either assume that they're athletes, or we assume that the way to connect with them is through athletics, or we assume that their worth is tied to athletics in certain ways, and communicating that is something that is very dangerous. In fact, it was mentioned in the opening bio that I had done a lot of work with the Obama administration in doing work with My Brother's Keeper and some of the other initiatives, and we did, and there was a lot of other folks who were also involved in that work. But I have had an opportunity to do a training on implicit bias during the Trump administration. In fact, the Department of Education invited me in. By the way, it was set up beforehand, in case you're wondering. And by the way, if anybody wants to know and talk about it sometime, the whole process for being able to go and present looked very different. Before, I could just go and show up and present. This time, I had to send every slide with exactly what I was going to say for every slide, and it had to be vetted by 3 levels of different committees. And so I got there, and I presented, and it was a voluntary session, so guess what? The people who showed up are the people who probably could have been doing the training themselves. I'm going to get to that point in a minute. But then, that was cool. It actually was better than I thought it would be. You know, it was at the Department of Ed, so the people who showed up are people who were mostly like career, long folks who were really there, through all administrations. But there were some other people who came. On the way home, I had basically my plane stopped in Phoenix, and basically got on the tarmac. And then basically what happened is that some people got off, and some people were getting on. But for those of us who were staying on, they said, yeah, you know what? Just go ahead, take a few moments, stand up, stretch, and we'll be boarding the incoming passengers. And so I did so, and there was a gentleman in front of me, and I love to wear community college gear, particularly for community colleges that are doing great work, because I like to rep them and talk about what they do, and I find it to be a pretty cool way of starting those conversations. And so I was wearing a college gear from one of the colleges that we do a lot of work with, and I would say that they are very committed to equity and social justice. And so I stand up, and a person in front of me stands up and turns around, and so we just start small chat. It seemed like the time to do it. And so, he asked me what I do. And I started to respond, and he's like, oh, like that. He kind of stopped me because he wanted to guess, which I don't know why you would want to guess what someone else does by looking at them. And I said, and he says, so I see that you have on that college sweater. So what, are you a football player? That was the first question. I was like, this is 2 years ago. I was like, no. And then he goes, oh, basketball, wow. He's like thinking to himself, he's not that tall, but maybe he can jump. No, I can't. And I said, no, I'm a professor. And you should have seen the look of shock. And I actually don't even believe that he believed me until we talked further. Because, I can be the nicest person in the world, and I think we have to bring care and love into this work and space that we do. But when someone doesn't think that I'm capable of doing the work that I do, then I start going off on all the stuff that I know, right? And then I kind of start feeling bad about it afterwards, but that's what I did. Yeah. So this faculty member, as a faculty member, asked me about this, and it turns out that I'm talking to a person, and he tells me that he is a professor as well. And I was thinking, if he does that to me, what does he do to his students? Right? And so these are things that happen oftentimes. And so we have to recognize that we have biases, and that we are communicating those biases at all times, and oftentimes we're not even aware of it. I just gave you examples of different people who have oftentimes good intentions, but we have to separate intent from impact. And so I do a lot of training on microaggressions and a lot of training on implicit biases. And one of the things that we find out from implicit biases is that we are more likely to trigger our implicit biases when there are 3 conditions that are in place. First, when we have incomplete information. So we don't know something. So in the context of seeing students outside the classroom, walking the other direction, putting our head down, pretending to get on the phones, we might be seeing the students like, oh, is that the one that's in my class or not? I don't really know. And instead of, so there's some uncomfortability, don't really know. So incomplete information. 2, when our time is constrained, so we're having to make quick decisions. And 3, when we're experiencing stress. So incomplete information, Time is constrained and experiencing stress. So, I don't know about y'all, but that represents Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every day of my life. And it's one of the reasons why we see so much work that's been done on implicit bias in education, incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress, but it's also the reason why we see so much work done on it in policing. If we think about it, an officer rolling up to a situation, incomplete information, their time's constrained, the nature of the job is stressful, and that produces life or death situations and names such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant III, Amadou Diallo, Alfred Olongo, Stephon Clark. We could go on and on. And so we can't be surprised when that occurs, because if we haven't done that pre-work first, then we are armed to do more damage than good. And I say armed to do more damage in an educational context, but in a policing context, it's actual. They are actually armed to do more damage than good. And that's not to pick on law enforcement, because we are guilty of doing the same things here. Every single day, unconsciously, implicitly. So, what are some other things that we're learning? I'm going to skip past this and talk just about some things other things that came up. Housing insecurities is an issue that we see across the state. This is data from the state of California on students who experience some form of housing insecurity. That's a student who can be homeless, couch surfing, sleeping in a car, sleeping in a closet, in some sort of untenable living situation. A lot of times at campuses, they'll see this data and say, oh, our students don't experience that. And then you collect data on their own campus and be like, wow, we had no idea. And the truth is because oftentimes we're unaware, because we don't have those relationships with students. We don't know the kinds of issues that they're going through. So housing insecurities is a big issue we see. You know what else is a big issue we see, particularly with, again, going back to our work on men of color, is employment barriers. Employment barriers. So oftentimes we see that they're concentrated in jobs that have three characteristics. First, they're in jobs that are physically demanding, moving boxes, digging ditches, stocking shelves, doing construction site cleanup. Second, they're in jobs that occur at night, so either working the late night shift or the overnight shift, because they get the shifts that nobody else wants. And third, they're in jobs that are temporary and transitory in nature, so moving into one job, out of that job, and another job, and out of that job. And so they're in through these constant transitions externally while they're trying to transition and be successful here. And for those of you who are aware of transition theory, that doesn't work well. And we heard about how, and through our work, we regularly hear about how this is an issue for our students. We also know that housing insecurities is a big issue. And what we find in our work, we don't do housing insecurity work, or food insecurity work rather. We find that food insecurities is a big issue, but we don't do this work in the same way that other people do. We do it in two different ways. One, we only focus on acute food insecurity. Acute food insecurity. So students who literally do not know where their next meal is going to come from. The second thing we do is that we collect our data differently than everyone else. Most research, in fact, not most, almost all research on food and housing insecurities is collected using online surveys. Now, for the methodologists in the room, can you tell me why that might not be good? Because if a student is struggling with food insecurities, housing insecurities, transportation concerns, and employment barriers, guess what? They may not have the same kind of access to technology to be able to participate in that study. So we collect our data in randomly selected course sections in person. And then people say, well, your data looks different than everyone else. And we say, yeah, because our data is good. It's not to say their data is bad, because they're still doing, of course, important work. But what we do find is that there's a lot of students, about 12 to 13% of students in our state, who experience acute food insecurity. So one of the things that we're also doing in our work is we're tying all these insecurities together, because what we find is that students don't experience food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, or employment barriers in isolation. They oftentimes experience them in tandem. In fact, 75% of students who experience acute food insecurity also experience housing insecurities. They're usually done in tandem. And so oftentimes you'll go to a campus and they'll be like, oh yeah, we have a food pantry. It's like, oh, that's awesome. Does that food pantry have secondhand clothing? Are there options for, working with nonprofits in the local area for affordable housing options? Are there connections to other services that students might need? Because you can fix one, but then if you're not fixing all, it may not have the same kind of effect. So it's just something for us to keep in mind when we do this work. Now, since a lot of the things I say oftentimes prioritize talking about faculty, I thought I'd talk about staff for a little bit, because you know what? They are an important part of this conversation, particularly those who are in matriculation, but all staff members, particularly those who are in matriculation, though, because a student will oftentimes engage 7, 8, 9 staff members before they'll ever engage with the faculty member in the classroom. So oftentimes students delay their enrollment, or they're concerned about coming to college, and they come here, they have a sense of anxiety associated with this, and then they go through all these different places and they receive micro messages that only serve to further reinforce that they're not good enough. And so it's important for us to think about, what do these practices look like? So we have identified in our work, as you can see here on the left-hand side, some of it's covered up, you'll see it fully on the next slide, different practices that we know based upon research that's been done by ourselves and our colleagues, practices that are important for influencing student success for minoritized students. Building relationships, having an institutional responsibility perspective, being equity-minded, microaggressions, welcoming their engagement. I'm going to get to talking about that later. A whole bunch of different practices and strategies, being intrusive, validation. And then what we've done is we surveyed faculty members and staff members from across the country, large samples, and then we identified colleges that were in the top quarter producing community colleges in the country. And then when we go to a college, we'll do the same survey, and then we'll compare them against those national benchmarks, disaggregated into different areas, to see how are we doing. Because we believe that the idea of a one-size professional development typically doesn't work, because different people have different needs. We think about that with students, but we oftentimes don't think about that with ourselves. So we basically encode our data on a fourfold structure, and behind all this is z-scores. But essentially, green is acceptable in comparison to the national benchmarks. Yellow is higher than the national benchmarks themselves, but not significantly higher. Orange is below the benchmarks, but not significantly lower, and then red is significantly lower than the benchmarks. So let's look at these different areas. All staff, matriculation, student services, academic services, campus life, and all other. And let's see what it looks like in terms of the color codes, where we see, based upon our data, are the biggest challenges from national perspective. All staff, the pattern looks bad, but there's a lot of needs attention, which is below the benchmarks, but there's some areas that are better than others. But what happens when we look at different groups? What we find is that some of our colleagues tend to do a better job than others. Now, the good thing is this college wasn't part of our data collection, so this is everybody else. Right? But it causes us to think. It causes us to think deeply about what occurs in these areas, that in terms of what we know are important practices for student success, are they occurring in matriculation? And in fact, in our work, what we find is that, again, there's those stereotypes I talked about, right? Ascription of intelligence, assumptions of criminality, pathologizing culture. We'll set aside the athletic piece for a moment. That there are some places that are what we call microaggression central. The first place that's microaggression central is not necessarily a location, but a group of individuals, and that's oftentimes policing and security, where they reinforce pathologizing assumptions of criminality. But we don't have to pick on them, because we got to pick on ourselves. The second place is financial aid, where notions of pathologizing culture are reinforced rigorously. Again, this is everybody else. And then ascriptions of intelligence are oftentimes very much reinforced in the library. So the three domains, policing and security, financial aid in the library, those are the three domains that we see some of the biggest challenges. And that's what you're seeing as part of this data here. But we can also look at what it looks like by different demographics, and we can see that some individuals tend to do better than others with some of these different practices. And sometimes individuals will see this, and there can be a sense of concern and a bit of, I'm using this in a way that's not meant to be offensive, but a bit of fragility when you see some data like this. All this data says is that, hey, we have to do better. And we can. We can do better. And based upon the commitment of this campus, I believe that you'll be one of the few campuses that will. In fact, I believe that this campus is going to do something different than every other campus that we've been able to go to. You're going to engage in equity work, and you're going to be successful in doing it. That would make you different. All right, so we got about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to something that I think is really important, and that's a taxonomy for thinking about where do you fall in this work. And as I go through this taxonomy, what I want you to do is this. I want you to think about where you are in this, but I also want you to think about your colleagues, where they are. And if you find yourself, after I talk about this, finding yourself in a position that you didn't want to see yourself in, then I challenge you to engage even more deeply. Again, that opening question that I had for you, are we prepared to be as uncomfortable as we expect our students to be every day? If you find yourself in a position that you don't like to see, to embrace that uncomfortability and to embrace engaging in this work, because it's important for the vitality of our students. So, what we find is that there are different people with different motivations when it comes to equity-based work. And it's based upon two different characteristics. The first is knowing what to do, so knowledge. And the second is having a willingness to do it. And knowing what to do and having a willingness to do it don't always go hand in hand. For example, I know how to work out. But I don't always do it. So they don't necessarily go hand in hand. So we can have the knowledge, and you'll see how this breaks out. So we have 4 boxes here. In the first box in the top right-hand corner are people who know what to do and those who have a willingness to do it. So people who know the strategies and practices that are important for serving students, and they're willing to do it. For those of you, and I know there's people here who've seen this before, what do we call individuals who both know what to do and they have a willingness to do it? The choir. These are the individuals who know the strategies and practices, and they're doing it. Now, let me tell you this. Oftentimes what we do is we focus on the choir, and that's important, but we focus on the choir. So how this taxonomy came to be is that we were oftentimes invited, and still are invited, to do a lot of work on microaggressions, and we'll go and we'll do a training, and someone will invite us out, and they'll have a room full of 30 people, 40 people, and it's a brown bag session, lunchtime session for people who wanted to come and learn about microaggressions. And the person who put it on, who put all this thought and energy and emotional energy into trying to put this on, will walk into the room and they'll be dismayed. And they'll be unhappy. Because when they decided to put this session together, it was in response to things that they were hearing from students, and what they really wanted was Jerry from chemistry to be there. Now, if there's a Jerry from chemistry, this isn't about you. I presented one time before, and there really was a Jerry from chemistry, and he wasn't too happy. But they had Jerry from chemistry in mind, and what they really wanted was for Jerry to be there, because everybody knows that Jerry microaggresses the heck out of his students. But Jerry isn't going to come to a voluntary session because Jerry doesn't necessarily care. And so who came are the people who probably could have been given the session themselves. So knowing what to do and having a willingness to do it, when we have a voluntary session, guess who shows up? It's the choir. And that's important because we need to engage the choir. We need to engage the choir because you still have things to learn. We still have things to learn. Every day we learn something new. We learn new language, we learn new practices, we learn new strategies, and sometimes we just need affirmation that we're on the right track. And so that's important. So if you see this and you say, hey, I'm one of those people that knows what to do and I'm willing to do it, I'm part of the choir, then thank you for being part of the choir. Now, we developed this taxonomy initially focused on our work with men of color. And what I will say is that we then recognized that there were some people who were allies for the work. They didn't know necessarily what to do, but maybe they were advocates for first-gen students, or they were advocates for students who experience food and housing insecurities, or they were advocates for other populations that may be minoritized, and they didn't necessarily know how to support men of color, but they knew about those populations, so the difference between them and the choir was really just knowledge and information on how to do that. So they had a commitment. They were committed to social justice. They were committed to educational equity, but what they needed was some additional professional learning to be able to get there. And so we also recognize that you can be a choir and you can be an ally in different spaces with different groups. And so you might say, hey, I'm a choir for this, but maybe I'm more of an ally for that. And if you find yourself being an ally more than a choir, then you have to do more learning. And I've learned every day in the job that I do. Now, that represents a good contingent, and it probably represents a good contingent of people who are in this room who didn't call out sick. Now, there's going to be some other groups. Now, there's the individuals on the bottom who are characterized by having an unwillingness to do it. The first are those who don't know what to do, and they're unwilling to do it. And we break that out into two different groups. Active resistors and passive resistors. They're all resistors, but there's active resistors and passive resistors. Active resistors will actively resist. When they hear that we're coming to do a professional development session, they'll tell people, this is reverse racism. Why are we focused on fill in the blank? Shouldn't we be focused on X? They're such a small part of our population. Why go? And not very far from here, and so since we've done work with almost every single college in this entire region, within 100 miles from here, there's a college that we went to where they found out that we were coming, myself and my colleague Frank, to do a session, a convocation on men of color, talking about some of the things that we had learned from our research. And the night before we got there, a faculty member was angry that we were coming and angry that this had been announced that this was taking place. So they sent an email to every single administrator, every single staff member, and every single faculty member, BCCing them, tell them this is an example of reverse racism and reverse discrimination. Don't go. Why are we doing this? Why are we focusing on this population? That happens. Went to a college in the South, and a lot of times people like to think that the South is bad, but you know what? The place where we've had the biggest challenges haven't been in the South. Actually, one of them is in Southern California. But we went to this college in the South, and this happened to be a campus where there was resistors, but the active resistor, was the president. We were invited in by a dean to do a training session on implicit bias, microaggressions, teaching practices for underserved students. We got to the training session, and no one was there. And it's because the president, when they found out, held a mandatory meeting at the same time to prevent people from going. Now, I can give you the examples of all the times that things like that have occurred, but one, we'd be here all day, but two, it might skew the idea that the active resistors are a larger population than they are. Because oftentimes, they're the smallest population on our campuses, but they're the most vocal and they're the most present, so we think that they represent a larger demographic than they really do. So you know what we have to do? We have to be as active in our support as they are active in their resistance to equity. We have to be as active in our support. And you know what that means? That means that the campus leadership, we need to give them support in doing this work, right? Now, what does that mean? Every single time you see the faculty senate president, the president, board members, you need to tell them this is important. Thank you for doing it. Because you know what? There's fear that goes into doing this work. I have seen people in doing this work, unfortunately, lose their jobs pushing for equity. They need to know that they have support, and it has to be vocal, because you know what? If we let the opposition be that vocal, then we have to counter it with our vocalness. So the best thing you can do, every single time you see it, see one of the individuals who's in charge, every single time you see Stephen, say, you know what? You're doing a good job. Thank you for doing it. Because too often in this work, it feels very isolated and very lonely. And there's a lot of emotional toil that goes into it. All right, now there's another group of resistors called the passive resistors. The passive resistors could be characterized as the don't know, don't care group. They don't really know the strategies and practices, and doesn't really care. So they're not going to raise a fuss. They're not going to say anything. Well, they might behind closed doors, but they're not going to say anything publicly. They're going to vote against it. And how they will vote is by their lack of presence. They simply won't come. Like, oh, I had a meeting at the same time. Really would love to come to that equity thing, but you know I'm there and I support you. It's like, well, you can only say that so many times before the fact that you aren't showing up is sending a message. So showing up, we tell our students showing up is half of it. Hey, showing up is really important for us as well when it comes to equity. So thank you for being here. Right? So passive resistors will passively resist. And so if you want to reach them, you have to go to the places and spaces that they're at. And I'll get to that in my closing slide. I'm on this. I'm almost done because I know I'm running out of time. Over time, probably. Okay. The defiant is another group. The defiant are the individuals who know what to do, but they're unwilling to do it. So these are the individuals who have been through training on microaggressions, implicit bias, teaching practices, all these important things, and they'll sit through those sessions just like this. Information going in one ear, out the other, and then they might go back and employ some of those practices and strategies with their comfort students, which are usually the students that look like them, or that resonate with them for some reason, but they won't employ them with some of our most minoritized populations. You also sometimes will see this, and this is the saddest case, but I've seen it enough times to recognize it takes place, is that sometimes you'll see people who are choir, who've been doing the work for so long, and are just burnt, and they're just tired. And sometimes they can become so tired that they become recalcitrant, and then sometimes they can become so recalcitrant that they become defiant in supporting the efforts themselves. So that's even more of a reason why it's important to give people the permission and support in doing this work. Now, some of you are seeing this, and you might be saying, well, you're missing a group. In fact, I was presenting this to an audience before, and one of our funders was in the room and said, Luke, I think you're missing a group. And now we've done a whole bunch of research to validate this and to try to make this as accurate as possible. We've done articles that have done qualitative work talking about these different domains. And so when someone tells you that you're missing something as a researcher, those are fighting words. But then, bringing myself back to demonstrate humility. All right, so what is it? And as soon as they said it, I was like, dang, how did we miss that? And so what they said is that you're missing a group, and that group is called the oblivious. These are the people who think they know what to do and really don't. And oftentimes, this is the group that can be the most detrimental to equity efforts because they think they're on the team. They think that they're choir. They think that they're allies, but they're not. And so what I really want you to think about deeply is, are you part of the choir, the allies, the resistors, the defiant, or the oblivious? And there's three different types of oblivious that we see. The first type are those that have a savior complex. They think that their role in this is to save because the communities that they're serving don't have the ability to do it on their own. So it's not about serving the community. It's not about helping the students because they have assets that need to be cultivated. It's about their own acceptance and their own forgiveness. And so if you are doing the work from the standpoint of I'm here to save, then that is bringing deficit mindsets into equity work. The second group are those who are non-reflective. These are the people who, they know what to say. They know to say Latinx as opposed to Latino because it's more gender inclusive. They know to say equity as opposed to equality because there's a different connotation. So they know the language. They know to use pronouns. They can do all those things, but then when you look at what they say and then you look at what they do, those things are totally removed from one another. And oftentimes what we find are these are people who started on an equity journey, and then they thought that they have arrived. And here's the truth. It's a journey, but there is no end in sight because we have to constantly work on ourselves and constantly grow in order to do this work in the right way. And then the last group that we see are those that are grandstanders. And you didn't used to see this a lot, but you see it a lot more often now because equity has become so important that it can help people's careers to be the equity champion. So I'm going to do a lot of things that look good and look shiny but have no meaningful effect because equity is something that I don't really care about. I just care about the public image that might come from me being one of those equity champions. So I ask you to think about, in closing, where do you fall in this taxonomy? Are you oblivious, bringing a savior complex to the work, being non-reflective, being a grandstander? Or are you doing the work for the right reasons? And there's no judgment that comes from me because one of the things that is the most important things we have to do and bring to this work is our own humility. And oftentimes, one of the things that derails the effort so much is that those of us who consider ourselves as part of the choir, and I'd like to think of myself as choir, but sometimes those of us who are in the choir, we can be so committed to the work, which we have to be, and see the outgrowth of what occurs to some of our students, and it hurts and pains us so much that we can become harsh towards those who might be those in the other groups. But what we have to do is this. We have to demonstrate the kind of love and care to them that we hope to see from them. We have to model the types of dispositions that we want to see. So as usual, I had a lot more stuff to cover, but I talk too much because I'm a professor and I like to talk. But we will close it off, and I will be here during lunch. I'll have the opportunity to engage with some folks in the administrative team. So if there's other things that you are hoping to hear, just ask me. If there were some additional strategies that you might want to hear about, just ask me. And I really just want to thank you for the work that you're doing, because the work that you are doing is about extolling the lives and minds of those who have been brought down for so long. So thank you for being champions for equity, and thank you for the invitation. So Stephen has said that we can take one or two quick questions, but that I have to be quick in responding.
Check. Is it on? All right. So if you have a question you are dying to ask, and you have to ask it, I would encourage you to come right now, right here, to the mic. There's one on that side, there's one on this side, but only two questions because we have limited time. And as Luke said, he is available over the lunch hour to talk with more folks.
Thank you, Stephen. Dr. Word, awesome job. Thank you very much. My question is, there's some of myself and my colleagues, we teach in the health education department, and we do cover a section that deals with microaggressions. And every time I have that slide up in the classroom, I don't think there's anything micro or small about those things. And I wonder if you feel the same way about that term, or if you've given any thought to that term, or maybe where, because to me, micro means small. And I look at those things and I listen to what you described, and none of that's small. You know?
Agreed. So microaggressions is, of course, the language that has come from psychologists who have done the work, starting with Pierce, and obviously many people might be familiar with the work of Darrell Sue. So they're trying to oftentimes separate what are macroaggressions that we see in society versus micro in terms of how we communicate. But I agree with you that there's nothing micro and there's nothing small about it. The other thing is that a lot of times we focus so much on the micro that we fail to recognize that there's a lot of very explicit and direct things that occur that aren't micro at all, that are occurring to our students. So
maybe with your power you can change the terminology.
right.
Yes. I heard somebody refer to them at a college I just went to, calling them compliments, because you're complimenting and dissing somebody at the same time. So maybe that's what we'll go with.
Well,
It's like, wow, you're so articulate. It's like, oh, okay. Thanks. So are you.
so I want to thank you so much. I've been teaching here for 20 years, and I believe you're the first African-American keynote speaker, and it really felt good to see you up there. And not only that, you knew what community colleges do. Shut up, and you had data. Okay. But my question is for a faculty member that might recognize that they're doing microaggressive behavior, i.e. the one that stepped back, what would be another thing that they could do once they catch themselves doing that? Because I'm not standing here acting like I don't have biases too, and so how could we learn? Is there something you would suggest?
So yes, there's actually a lot of things I would suggest. So one, I do believe in acknowledging when we make missteps. I think that oftentimes people don't want to do so because they're worried that, oh, someone's going to file a complaint if I misstep. But what happens really is when you acknowledge it, you're oftentimes affirming the experience that that person has had. And so what we find in our work is that when people acknowledge that those things have occurred, that it's actually a much more healthy way of doing it. Now, you have to do it in a way that doesn't further microaggress them. And you can see that take place with people with, again, good intent but not necessarily good impact. We also, in our work, we do a very specific training on how you can respond to them, and we have a taxonomy, not necessarily focused on what we do with ourselves, because I think that the first thing we have to do as ourselves is basically acknowledge it and basically have the opportunity to restate. So one of the things that we do when it happens on that individual level, like if I've done something, I want to acknowledge it, and then I want to say, I know that I just might have communicated this, but I hope you would allow me to restate what I said in a different way. And then you try to basically express what's on your heart, not maybe more tacitly involved. But what we see probably more regularly than that is that microaggressions occur in our classrooms all the time by one student to another student, and we don't do anything about it. And so we have a taxonomy called the Raven approach on essentially how to respond to it. And very quickly, the R stands for you have to redirect. So if one student microaggresses another one, redirect immediately because you're allowing harm to continue. And what oftentimes will happen is that people will just try to ignore it because it's uncomfortable, we don't know how to do it, and it's like, okay, should I, as maybe it's a person, as a white person, should I as a white faculty member step in here? Like, how do I do so? And there's concerns about it. But yes, actually you have the responsibility to step in, and it's even more important to step in. So redirecting and stopping that harm from occurring. A would be asking questions. So I heard you refer to those students as coming from bad communities, right? Can you tell me what you mean by bad? So asking questions as opposed to eviscerating them, which sometimes our actual reaction is to want to eviscerate because we know how harmful those things are. But this is a learning institution, so we want them to have an opportunity to think about what they said. And so asking multiple questions that gets along that. Values clarification, saying, as an institution, we are committed to equity, we're committed to inclusion, we're committed to diversity. And because of those values, some of those things that might be said, that you've said, may not align with what we'd like to see. And then you want to basically provide more of an empathetic response to it, where you're talking about, when I hear you say that, this is how I feel, or this is what someone from that community may feel when they hear you say this. So again, you're not punching them in the face with it, right? You're using a very kind of indirect approach to bring it to their attention. And the last thing to do is provide them with next steps. So saying, in the future, I would hope that, that you would think about doing this differently. And so that's a quick and dirty of what would be normally like a 3-hour workshop, so you're welcome.
I'm so sorry I got so nervous when I got up there, and next time could we have a panel of what happens to teachers of color, how we're treated by colleagues and students?
Yes. Yes, I think that would be very important to do. And in fact, my role at San Diego State is primarily doing that work and looking at how in our evaluation processes, particularly in student evaluations, that there's a lot of things that we should be looking for in terms of code language. And if a faculty member is teaching a class that deals in any way, shape, or form with issues of diversity, inclusion, social justice, educational equity, or if they're a faculty from a minoritized group in general, we should expect that there's going to be differences that are going to come up in their evaluations. But one of the biggest things that we can always look for is grade bombing. If you look at someone's evaluations and you're just looking at the overall mean, and we're not getting at, like, are there students who score this person as a 1 all the way down, right? If the rest of the students in the class are scoring this person as, on a scale of like 1 to 5 as 4s and 5s, but then you got like 3 students that scored them as 1s, we know that the mean is highly susceptible, right, to extreme values. So just a few students putting 1s all the way down can majorly drop someone's course evaluation and suggest that someone is an inferior professor, when in fact it's not that they were inferior, but that the person who was engaging them as a student didn't think that they belonged there. So I agree that that should definitely be something that should occur. So with that, I'm getting the hook. And I appreciate the time. And again, thank you.